Welcome back to Relics of Time. If you enjoy deep historical documentaries about forgotten cities, ancient civilizations, and the rise and fall of empires, make sure to like this video, leave a comment with the next place or civilization you want to explore, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future journeys into the past. Today, we are traveling to one of the oldest and most contested cities in human history. A city whose name still echoes across the modern world, often surrounded by tragedy, conflict, and pain. But long before the headlines of today, long before modern borders and modern wars, Gaza was already ancient. It was already important. It was already a place where empires collided, armies marched, merchants traded, and civilizations left their mark. This is the story of ancient Gaza. To understand Gaza, we must begin with geography, because geography is the invisible force that shaped its destiny. Ancient Gaza stood near the southeastern corner of the Mediterranean coast, in a strategic corridor between Egypt and the Levant. To the south and west lay the routes toward the Nile Valley, the most powerful and stable civilization of the ancient Near East for long stretches of history. To the north and east lay Canaan, Syria, Mesopotamia, and the great inland empires that would rise and fall over thousands of years. Gaza was not isolated. It was not a remote desert outpost. It was a gate, a threshold, a hinge between worlds. This location made Gaza valuable in ways that few cities could rival. It sat along the coastal highway later known in Roman times as the Via Maris, the great road that connected Egypt with the lands to the north. It was also tied to inland caravan networks that brought incense, spices, resins, textiles, metals, and luxury goods from Arabia and beyond. To control Gaza was to influence trade. To control Gaza was to monitor armies. To control Gaza was to secure a frontier. And that meant that nearly every major power in the region would, at some point, seek to possess it. The earliest traces of settlement in the Gaza region go back deep into prehistory. Archaeological evidence from the broader southern Levant shows that this coastal zone was inhabited long before written history. Small agricultural communities, early trade contacts, and regional cultural exchange all existed in this area before Gaza emerged as a major urban center. By the Bronze Age, the region had become part of a wider network of Canaanite city-states and Egyptian influence. And it is in this era that Gaza begins to step into the light of recorded history. During the Bronze Age, especially in the second millennium BC, Egypt's relationship with southern Canaan became increasingly important. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom, after driving out the Hyksos and expanding their influence into the Levant, viewed the coastal corridor as essential. It was both a buffer zone and a military highway. Armies moving north had to pass through it. Invaders moving south could use it as well. Cities like Gaza became vital nodes in a chain of control that linked Egyptian power to the wider Near East. Ancient Egyptian records suggest that Gaza was one of the key administrative and military centers in the region. It served as a staging ground, a logistical hub, and a gateway. Pharaohs and their officials understood that if Egypt wanted to maintain its presence in Canaan and beyond, it needed strong points along the route. Gaza was one of the most important of them. It was not simply a town on the edge of empire. It was one of the doors through which empire moved. Imagine the city in this period. Mud brick walls rising from the earth. Storehouses filled with grain, oil, wine, and tribute. Scribes recording deliveries on tablets and papyrus. messengers arriving with orders from Egyptian governors, merchants haggling in the markets over copper, timber, livestock, and fine goods, soldiers from different backgrounds passing through the gates, local Canaanite traditions blending with the influence of one of the greatest powers of the age. Gaza, even at this early stage, was already a place of intersection. But the Bronze Age world was fragile. It depended on complex systems of trade, diplomacy, tribute, and military balance. In the late 2nd millennium BC, that world began to crack. Across the eastern Mediterranean, kingdoms fell, palaces burned, trade routes were disrupted, and long-standing political systems collapsed. Historians still debate the exact causes. Climate stress, internal unrest, migrations, invasions, and economic breakdown likely all played a role. What is clear is that the old order was breaking apart. It is in the aftermath of this upheaval that one of the most famous chapters in Gaza's history begins: the Age of the Philistines. The Philistines are among the most recognizable peoples of the ancient Near East, largely because of their appearance in the Hebrew Bible. But the historical Philistines were far more complex than the simplified image that later traditions often preserve. Archaeology suggests that the Philistines were part of a broader movement of peoples in the eastern Mediterranean during the late Bronze Age collapse, likely with some connections to the Aegean world. Over time, they settled along the southern coastal plain of Canaan and became a major regional force. Their power centered around a group of cities often referred to as the Philistine Pentapolis: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Among these, Gaza stood as one of the most significant. It was a political center, a military center, and perhaps most importantly, a commercial center. It connected the Philistine world to Egypt, to inland Canaanite and Israelite territories, and to the broader trade systems of the Mediterranean and Arabian routes. The Philistine period transformed Gaza's identity, but it did not erase what came before. Like so many ancient cities, Gaza did not begin again from nothing. Instead, it absorbed new populations, new customs, new political structures, and new cultural influences. Archaeologists have found evidence of distinctive Philistine material culture in the region, including pottery styles that show Aegean influence, changes in diet, and evolving urban forms. Yet over time, the Philistines also became deeply rooted in the Levant, adopting local languages, religious practices, and patterns of life. Gaza was not a frozen symbol of one people. It was a living city, constantly reshaped by contact and adaptation. In biblical tradition, Gaza is often portrayed as a Philistine stronghold. It appears in some of the most famous stories associated with the conflict between the Israelites and the Philistines. One of the best known is the story of Samson, who is said to have visited Gaza and later been brought there as a captive. In the dramatic climax of that story, he destroys a great temple by pulling down its pillars. Whether or not the story reflects a specific historical event, its very existence tells us something important. Gaza was remembered as a place of power, wealth, and religious significance. It was important enough to become part of cultural memory. The Philistine era was not peaceful. The southern Levant was a landscape of shifting alliances, border warfare, and local rivalries. The Israelites, Philistines, Canaanite groups, and later larger imperial powers all interacted in a contested environment. Gaza's location made it a natural prize, but also a natural target. Yet once again, the same pattern appears. The city endured because it mattered. It was too valuable to abandon, too strategic to ignore, and too integrated into regional systems to vanish. Eventually, the age of relatively independent Philistine city-states gave way to the rise of larger empires from the east. First came the Assyrians, whose military machine reshaped the political map of the Near East in the first millennium BC. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was unlike anything the region had seen before in terms of administrative reach, military organization, and ideological display of power. When Assyria expanded westward, it demanded tribute, loyalty, and submission from the cities of the Levant. Gaza, like many cities in the region, had to navigate this new reality. Sometimes that meant paying tribute. Sometimes it meant rebellion. Sometimes it meant shifting allegiances based on the balance of power between Assyria and Egypt. Ancient rulers in frontier cities often had little room for error. If they backed the wrong side, the consequences could be devastating. Assyrian records mention Gaza and its rulers, showing that the city was firmly within the orbit of imperial politics. One notable ruler associated with Gaza in Assyrian sources is Hanunu, who appears in the context of resistance and realignment during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III. This was the world of coercion and calculation. Cities like Gaza could not simply exist in peace while empires fought around them. They were forced to choose, to submit, to resist, or to survive through careful maneuvering. Assyrian warfare was terrifying. Siege engines, mass deportations, public displays of punishment, and brutal military campaigns were designed not only to defeat enemies, but to frighten future rebels. If Gaza resisted, it risked destruction. If it submitted, it lost autonomy. This was the paradox of strategic cities on imperial frontiers. Their importance guaranteed both wealth and danger. After the Assyrians came the Babylonians. The Neo-Babylonian Empire inherited much of Assyria's western sphere after the collapse of Assyrian power in the late 7th century BC. This was another age of transition, another moment when old structures collapsed and new masters emerged. The Babylonian campaigns in the Levant, especially under Nebuchadnezzar II, are better known because of their impact on Judah and Jerusalem, but the entire region was affected. Gaza, once again, found itself in the path of imperial transformation. Then came the Persians. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great and expanded by his successors, created one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. But unlike the Assyrians, whose image was tied so strongly to terror and domination, the Persians often ruled through a more flexible and pragmatic system. They organized territories into satrapies, respected local elites when possible, and focused heavily on maintaining roads, communications, taxation, and imperial stability. For Gaza, Persian rule likely meant incorporation into a larger administrative and economic framework that connected the eastern Mediterranean to a vast imperial system stretching from Egypt and Anatolia to Central Asia and beyond. Once again, Gaza's location worked in its favor. It remained a vital point in the movement of goods, officials, and military forces. It was still a gate between Egypt and the Levant. It was still a place that mattered. And then, in the 4th century BC, one of the most dramatic moments in Gaza's ancient history arrived with the coming of Alexander the Great. After defeating the Persian king Darius III at Issus in 333 BC, Alexander moved south along the eastern Mediterranean coast. His goal was clear: He needed to neutralize Persian naval bases, secure the coastline, and ultimately move toward Egypt. Most cities along the route either surrendered or were taken after varying degrees of resistance. Tyre became famous for its extraordinary siege. But Gaza, too, would become a symbol of defiance. The governor of Gaza, often identified in ancient sources as Battus, refused to submit. This was no small decision. Alexander's army was battle-hardened, ambitious, and led by a commander whose reputation for relentless advance was already legendary. Yet Gaza did not simply open its gates. It resisted. Ancient writers described Gaza as strongly fortified, positioned on elevated ground, and difficult to assault. Alexander's forces had to undertake a serious siege, building up earthworks and employing siege machinery to attack the city's defenses. The struggle was intense. Gaza's defenders understood what was at stake. This was not just a battle for one city. It was a final stand on the road to Egypt. The siege of Gaza became one of the most dramatic confrontations of Alexander's southern campaign. Eventually, after heavy fighting, the city fell. Ancient accounts emphasize the brutality of the aftermath, though details vary and ancient historians often dramatized such events. What matters is that Gaza entered historical memory as a city that resisted one of history's greatest conquerors and paid a terrible price. And yet, as so often in its long history, Gaza did not disappear. Under the Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged after Alexander's death, Gaza remained an important urban center. The division of Alexander's empire led to centuries of struggle between his successors, especially the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria and Mesopotamia. Gaza stood near the frontier of these competing powers, which only reinforced its importance. It was once again a city between empires. Hellenistic Gaza was a place of cultural blending. Greek influence spread through administration, architecture, language, and elite culture, but older local traditions did not vanish overnight. Instead, the city became part of the rich and often complicated process we call Hellenization. Public spaces, civic institutions, artistic styles, and forms of learning all reflected the presence of the Greek world, while local religious practices, Semitic traditions, and long-established commercial habits continued to shape everyday life. This is one of the most fascinating truths about ancient Gaza. It was never purely one thing. It was never entirely Egyptian, entirely Philistine, entirely Persian, or entirely Greek. It was layered. Every conqueror left something behind, but none of them could completely erase what came before. Economically, the city continued to thrive because of trade. Caravans from Arabia brought incense, myrrh, perfumes, precious goods, and exotic materials northward. These commodities were highly valued across the Mediterranean and Near East. Gaza became one of the key transfer points where inland-desert commerce met coastal exchange. Goods could be stored, taxed, redistributed, and moved onward by land or sea. Wealth flowed through the city not only because rulers wanted it, but because merchants needed it. This trade was not abstract. It shaped the urban landscape. Warehouses, markets, inns, animal enclosures, workshops, and customs points would all have played a role in the functioning of the city. Scribes kept records. Brokers negotiated deals. Laborers unloaded goods. Caravan leaders coordinated routes and protection. Priests, officials, and local elites all benefited from the flow of commerce. In many ways, Gaza's resilience was built as much on economics as on military strength. By the 1st century BC, the eastern Mediterranean was once again undergoing a massive transformation. Rome was rising. As Roman power expanded into the Hellenistic world, the old successor kingdoms weakened and collapsed. Pompey's campaigns in the Near East and the growing influence of Rome over Syria, Judea, and Egypt changed the political order of the region forever. Gaza, like so many ancient cities, had to adapt once more. Under Roman rule, Gaza became part of a vast imperial system that linked Britain to Egypt, Hispania to Syria, and North Africa to the Balkans. The scale of Roman infrastructure, administration, and trade was extraordinary. Roads were improved. Ports were integrated into wider economic circuits. Taxation was systematized. Urban life in many cities expanded under the relative stability of Roman power, especially during periods of peace. Gaza flourished in this environment. It remained important because its old advantages had not disappeared. The routes to Egypt still mattered. The caravan networks from Arabia still mattered. Its position on the Mediterranean frontier of the Levant still mattered. In the Roman period, Gaza became known not just as a strategic city, but as a prosperous one. Classical sources and archaeological evidence suggest that Roman Gaza had a lively urban culture. Public buildings, temples, streets, markets, and civic institutions all played a role in city life. It was part of the Greco-Roman world, yet still deeply rooted in the Eastern Mediterranean. This combination gave Gaza a distinctive identity. It was connected to the imperial center, but it was not a copy of Rome. It was its own city, shaped by centuries of prior history. Religion in Roman Gaza was especially interesting. The city became known as a stronghold of traditional pagan cults for longer than some neighboring areas. Local deities and Hellenized forms of worship remained influential. Temples, festivals, and civic religious life continued to play an important role. This would later make Gaza a notable site of religious tension during the spread of Christianity. But before we reach that point, it is worth pausing to imagine daily life in Roman Gaza. Picture a bustling street lined with stone buildings and shaded arcades. Traders calling out prices in multiple languages. Greek spoken by educated elites, local Semitic dialects used in homes and markets, Latin heard in official or military settings. Amphorae filled with wine and oil. Imported ceramics. Fine textiles. Perfumes from Arabia. Grain shipments. Animals from inland routes. Sailors, soldiers, pilgrims, merchants, farmers, scribes, craftsmen, and travelers all crossing paths in a city that had become, once again, a meeting point of worlds. Then came another transformation, one that would change the spiritual landscape of the Mediterranean and Near East, the spread of Christianity. By the late Roman and Byzantine periods, Christianity had grown from a persecuted minority faith into a dominant force of imperial culture. But this transition did not happen everywhere at the same pace, and Gaza is a perfect example of that complexity. The city had deep pagan traditions, and these traditions remained strong for a long time. In fact, Gaza became known as one of the places where pagan cults persisted more stubbornly than in many neighboring urban centers. This persistence created tension. Christian missionaries, bishops, imperial officials, and local pagan elites all played roles in the slow and often contentious religious transformation of the city. Ancient texts associated with figures like Porphyry of Gaza describe struggles over temples, conversions, political pressure, and the reshaping of sacred space. Some of these texts are highly partisan and must be read critically, but they still reveal the intensity of the transition. By the Byzantine era, Gaza had become an important Christian city, but its memory of older religious life did not vanish overnight. Churches rose where older cult sites once stood. Monastic communities developed in the surrounding region. Pilgrims moved through the broader landscape of the Holy Land. Yet the city's identity remained layered, just as it always had been. One of the most remarkable features of Byzantine Gaza was its intellectual life. The city became known for its schools and its literary culture, especially in the realm of rhetoric and classical education. Scholars, teachers, and writers connected to the so-called School of Gaza helped preserve and continue elements of Greek literary tradition even in a Christian imperial world. This is deeply significant. It reminds us that ancient Gaza was not only a place of war and conquest. It was also a place of thought. Too often, when people imagine ancient frontier cities, they picture only fortresses and battlefields. But cities like Gaza were also places where ideas traveled. Education, literature, law, philosophy, theology, and administration all depended on urban networks. Gaza was part of those networks. It was a place where memory was written, not just fought over. And then, in the 7th century, the region experienced yet another monumental shift, the rise of Islam and the Arab conquests. When Muslim Arab armies expanded out of Arabia, the Byzantine and Sasanian worlds were already weakened by years of devastating war. The Near East was exhausted. Administrative systems were strained. Populations were burdened. In this context, the rapid expansion of the early Islamic State transformed the political and religious landscape of the region with extraordinary speed. Gaza, once again, became part of a new order. For many cities, such transitions meant destruction or decline. But for Gaza, the pattern was familiar. It adapted. It persisted. It was incorporated into the new Islamic world, where its location still mattered, its commercial role still mattered, and its historical depth still shaped its identity. Though our focus today is on ancient Gaza, it is impossible not to see how this continuity across eras is one of the city's most defining features. This is what makes Gaza so historically extraordinary. It is not simply that it was old. Many places are old. It is not simply that it was fought over. Many strategic cities were. What makes Gaza unique is the sheer continuity of significance. Across Egyptian domination, Philistine power, Assyrian pressure, Babylonian transition, Persian administration, Hellenistic competition, Roman urbanization, Byzantine transformation, and early Islamic incorporation, Gaza remained relevant. That kind of endurance is rare, and yet, the city's importance also came at a cost. Gaza's geography was both its blessing and its burden. The same roads that brought wealth brought armies. The same strategic position that created prosperity invited invasion. The same role as a crossroads that made it cosmopolitan also made it vulnerable. This duality lies at the heart of Gaza's story. It was never just a victim of history, and it was never simply a passive stage. It was an active participant in the making of the ancient Near East. But it was also repeatedly exposed to the ambitions of powers larger than itself. If we step back and look at the bigger picture, Ancient Gaza helps us understand the ancient world in miniature. It shows us how cities become important because of trade and geography. It shows us how cultural identities are layered, not fixed. It shows us that conquest does not automatically erase local memory. It shows us how religion changes slowly, through tension and adaptation, not only through dramatic moments. It shows us that borderlands are not empty edges of civilization, but often its most dynamic and creative zones. And perhaps most importantly, it shows us that survival can be one of the greatest historical achievements of all. Because Gaza survived. It survived the collapse of Bronze Age systems. It survived the rise and fall of the Philistines. It survived Assyrian domination. It survived the age of Babylon and Persia. It resisted Alexander. It endured Hellenistic rivalry. It prospered under Rome. It transformed under Byzantium. It adapted under early Islam. Again and again, the city changed hands, changed rulers, changed languages, changed religions, and changed political systems. But it remained. When modern people hear the name Gaza, it is often impossible to separate it from contemporary suffering. And that is understandable. The pain of the present is real. But history asks us to see more than one moment. It asks us to recognize that places are deeper than headlines. Gaza is not only a site of modern tragedy. It is one of the oldest continuously significant urban landscapes in the entire Eastern Mediterranean world. It is a city whose roots run through the foundations of civilization itself. That does not erase the present. But it gives a depth. It reminds us that Gaza was once a city of merchants and scholars, of temples and churches, of caravans and ships, of scribes and soldiers, of governors and priests, of farmers and artisans, of conquerors and survivors. It was a city where empires came to claim power, and where power itself often proved temporary. The walls fell. The rulers changed. The flags changed. The gods changed. The languages changed. But the place endured. There is something profoundly human in that. Ancient Gaza teaches us that history is not only about the winners. It is not only about emperors, generals, and conquerors whose names fill textbooks. It is also about cities that absorb the weight of centuries and continue to exist. It is about communities that rebuild after destruction. It is about memory layered in stone, dust, and roadways. It is about the stubborn persistence of place. And perhaps that is why Gaza still matters so much, even in the deepest historical sense. Because Gaza is not merely a location on a map. It is a symbol of continuity under pressure. A symbol of civilization at the crossroads. A symbol of how geography can shape destiny across thousands of years. And a symbol of how some cities become more than cities. They become witnesses. Witnesses to trade, to war, to faith, to empire, to collapse, to renewal, witnesses to us. So when we speak of ancient Gaza, we are not speaking of a forgotten ruin alone. We are speaking of a living historical thread that runs from the Bronze Age to the modern world. A thread touched by Egyptians, Philistines, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, and early Muslims. A thread woven through the story of the Near East itself. If you look closely, you can almost see it. The dust rising behind a caravan from Arabia. The glint of bronze on a Philistine spear. The shadow of Assyrian standards on the horizon. The thunder of siege engines under Alexander's command. The murmur of Greek rhetoric in a late antique school. the bells of churches in the Byzantine era, the call of a new age arriving from Arabia, and beneath it all, the city. Still there, still standing in memory, still carrying the weight of empires, still refusing to be reduced to only one chapter. That is the legacy of Ancient Gaza. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment telling me which ancient city or civilization you want to explore next, and subscribe to Relics of Time for more long-form historical documentaries. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next journey through the forgotten worlds that shaped our history.